Each year, as November approaches, I always start reflecting on the Great War. I've had a fascination with the war for years now. I'm convinced it is the real axial point of modern history, far more so than the Second World War, for it is the Great War that derailed the progress of European civilization and brought our multi century period of undisputed global dominance to an end. I always try to pick up some new reading on the subject, and this year I came across Winged Victory, a novel of the Air War written by Victor Maslin Yeates. The Air War seems to combine the mystery of adventure, the excitement of technological process, with the tragedy and heroism that we most often associate with the war, as well as a heavy dose of chivalry. To quote Lord George, a man in many respects responsible for the birth of Britain's RAF, the heavens are their battlefield. They are the cavalry of the clouds, high above the squalor and the mud, so high in the firmament that they are not visible from earth. They fight out the eternal issues of right and wrong. Victor Maslin Yeates was himself a pilot of the Royal Flying Corps and then RAF, who between February and August 1918 flew a Sopwith Camel biplane in 110 operations, amounting to 248 hours of flight time. He fought in dogfights, brought down enemy planes and a balloon, and survived crashing his Sopwith Camel 4 times. In this video, I'm using some lovely Great War aerial combat game footage, clips taken from two very nice flight simulator gaming channels, Red Falcon and Ariane Shafi. If you like flight simulators and if you like the Great War in computer game form, go check those channels out. And while you're at it, do me a favor and hit like and subscribe. Thank you. While I'd read about the air war previously, this is a particularly great book for a cockpit's eye view of the Great War pilot's experience and caused me to reflect on some assumptions about early air war combat that we'll discuss later in the video. Whether you have read much about the war or aviation previously or not, I'd recommend this book for its detailed descriptions of flying, insights into the Great War pilot's mind, the portrayal of the pilot's life away from the cockpit in wartime France, and the sometimes great pathos of what is a very tragic, if also exciting, war story. The story concerns a cultured young English pilot called Tom Cullen and his fellow pilots, which includes many Canadians and Australians, as well as later some Americans, stationed somewhere in France through the last year or so of the war. At no point is Tom Cullen portrayed as an especially enthusiastic warrior, but he does enjoy his flying and is a talented airman who values his camaraderie with the other members of his flight. We follow him and his team through a great number of aerial adventures in which the stakes steadily rise. Initially, the advantage seems to be all with the British, who have the best machines and the best pilots at that particular time. But as the nature of their missions change, and with the appearance of better German fighter planes, so the death toll steadily increases. With this progression, there is a gradually increasing sense of impending doom, the romance and enthusiasm becoming gradually replaced with fear, tension, and regret at the loss of comrades. And damned does Tom Cullen lose a lot of comrades. This, of course, reflects the horrific reality of the Great War in the air, where the average life expectancy of new pilots was barely more than a month. Even the characters who, like Tom, are considered old hands at flying, started their aerial careers in late 1917 or early 1918. All this takes its toll on Tom's physical and psychological strength. He becomes increasingly dependent on his two closest friends for mental support, but the death of one early on leaves him relying on the other even more. This is his friend Williamson. Williamson is a more psychologically grounded individual, an intelligent man who nonetheless fights his war without overthinking things he can't control. He provides a source of stoic strength that helps keep Tom from completely losing his nerve. The Germans' new Fokker D-12 emerges to wreak havoc in the skies of war, outclassing Tom's Sopwith Camel, just as Tom and Williamson are edging close to completing their stipulated period of flying service. And the great drama of the last act of the book is Tom trying to keep himself and his friend alive just long enough to make it home. One tragic fact that came through in the story to me is just how dangerous flying Great War planes was, whether the other side was shooting at you or not. Very early on, Tom Cullen crashes his Sopwith camel, and we learn that it wasn't his first experience of hitting the ground and destroying his machine. Other characters in the novel just die out of nowhere because their plane has some malfunction, or they are horribly injured just trying to take off from the ground. The limitations of Great War radio technology also means they have very restricted ways of communicating with each other, waving by hand or shaking their wings, and so they usually have no idea of what exactly is going wrong in their fellow pilot's cockpit. So, assuming our courageous pilots aren't killed by their own machines or their own mistakes, they then meet a variety of different missions, all described in the novel. There are patrols looking for German two-seater reconnaissance planes, escorts for British reconnaissance, bomb dropping, low-flying attacks on the enemy on the ground, and of course, the classic dogfight that we most associate with the birth of air combat. Let me briefly share with you now an example of aerial combat from the novel. The dogfight had spread, and they were fighting a duel. He was quite sure the Thals could not get him in a level scrap, and his heart was calm. It was faster, but he could turn inside it and take snapshots to worry the pilot who could not reply. Tom looked on at his body, automatically flying and firing short bursts. The Thals pilot ought to dive away and chance it. He could not hope to beat a properly handled camel at vertical turns, and he must realize by now that this camel was being handled competently. They fought down and down, losing height all the time. Tom wished he could end it. He fired a long burst, and the Thals turned away from it and gave Tom an easy shot while he was reversing bank. Tom fired, but got into the Thals' slipstream, which threw him all over the place. Nevertheless, the Thals slowly dropped its nose and turned over on its right side. It was the end. The angle of its dive increased until it was going vertically down with the terrible impetus of a full engine dive. It's clear from that excerpt that while pilotship is important, the planes themselves represent a great limiting factor to what can be expected of your pilots. As an experienced pilot flying his camel Sopwith, Tom could feel confident engaging the Thals. This British upper hand is maintained through most of the novel, but later the Germans sent forth their Fokker D7, and Tom and his friends now find their machines outclassed, with terrible consequences. Very many of the characters of the novel are based on real people. Tom's friend Williamson is based on the English Great War veteran and novelist Henry Williamson, author of the nature novel Taka the Otter. The real-life Williamson was a trench fighter rather than a pilot, who supported Victor Maslin Yeates in his post-war illness and helped him with the editing of this novel. The two of them form the core of the novel, but some other important characters based on real people include Mac, based on real-life Canadian pilot Donald McLaren, who had 54 victories, all in 1918 with the Sopwith Camel. Robinson, based on Harry Robinson, 10 victories, who later served in Iraq. Tommy, based on George Edwin Thompson, 21 victories, who died in a flying accident in 1918. Flight leader Mac, in particular, has an important role in the novel as a sort of Fortinbras to Tom's Hamlet. While Tom struggles with the mental pressure of war and gradually loses all enthusiasm, Mac is entirely at peace with his role. He has indeed found a purpose in life. His purpose is to kill as many enemies as possible, and he aggressively pursues this goal. His description reminds me, in fact, of Ernst Junger's portrayal of himself in his excellent memoir, Storm of Steel. Men like this found meaning from war. Other pilots look up to Mac and seek to emulate them, pushing themselves to pick up as many victories as possible. You could say the pilots of the novel all exist on a spectrum. On one end, you have pilots like Mac, for whom the war and aerial combat in particular has become a calling. On the other hand, you have pilots willing to fly, but showing no passion for the kill. Tom was initially somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, but gradually shifts towards reluctance as the novel progresses. I think there's a lot of value in a novel that shows the range of responses to the demands of combat. I take some issue with the way the war and its soldiers are sometimes portrayed as entirely cynical or indifferent. A lot of that is retroactive disappointment with the aftermath of war. It's important to note here, Yeates himself wrote the book in 1934, when there were plenty of reasons to be disappointed with the political and economic aftermath of the war. It's clear in this portrayal that the war elicited heroism as well as cynicism. aggression and bloodlust, as well as pacifism and disappointment. A final aspect of the novel I want to reflect on is the portrayal of patriotism in the novel. For all his growing disillusionment, Tom Cullen is a patriot who loves England. Just listen to this from about midway in the novel when he is on leave to return briefly to England. The evening was delicious. Hedgerows again, white with hawthorn, between golden green meadows and brown green cornfields on the wooded greensand. Beyond Ashford, the wold. This was his native land, wandering lanes hedged and ditched. This was England. He had forgotten how lovely England was. All this incredible, jocund, casual beauty. It was difficult to keep back the tears. He resented the emotion, fought it, called it murderous, deceitful. If it had been a dull and rainy evening, but it was useless. The emotion constricted his throat. It seemed deep and real. All his other feelings appeared shallow and meretricious in the shock of discovering how unquenchable, how real was his love of England. His growing cynicism is present here already, but it has not yet taken over. Besides his friendship with Williamson, his English patriotism keeps Tom both sane and in uniform. But it is starting to erode, and by the end of the novel, he finds himself returned to England, friendless and sick, and no longer able to summon the same emotions for his country. This in itself is a great tragedy, one of the key tragedies of the novel, and one of the tragedies of the war, the undermining of older traditional values like patriotism. Taking these young, strong, patriotic young men and wasting them, and wasting their national feeling. No doubt you could find plenty of counterexamples of men who remain just as patriotic as ever. However, old assumptions were shaken, and not always for the better. Tom Cullen's patriotism was put to the ultimate test, along with his physical and mental fortitude, and it broke. There is a variety of meme that mocks veterans of the World Wars for the courage they displayed in causes that turned out to have highly questionable outcomes where the future and well-being of Europe is concerned. I don't quite support that sentiment because these young men could not possibly have been able to see how it was going to turn out in the long run. Nonetheless, on Armistice Day and Remembrance Sunday, I do think we should reflect on the mistakes made in the 20th century. Let's remember the heroism and patriotism of the Great War generation. Let's emulate that heroism and patriotism to the best of our ability. But let's not waste those qualities on dubious foreign policy adventures. Let's make sure that next time, if we have to fight, we fight for a cause that serves the interests of England, of the West, of European civilization as a whole.